I'm joined today by Ron Vaillant to express his concern, and it should be your concern as well, over what he describes, and I have to concur, is perhaps the most important story in Canada not being told, not being covered by the media. And that is the story of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll stress that word, peoples, not people, not individuals. This is about peoples, groups. And UNDRIP, as it's called, was adopted by the UN General Assembly back in 2007 after being bounced back and forth for about 20 years. Canada endorsed it fully back in 2016. That's with the Liberal government, of course. And in December of this past year, 2020, there was a bill introduced, Bill C-15, which I would encourage our viewers and listeners to look up, because this is going to affect everybody in this country, not the least of which would be the descendants of Aboriginals, the Indigenous people, the First Nations, however you want to call them, because a number of them actually disagree with what's going on with Bill C-15. And to, Ron Vaillant, I think it's important that people know who you are, in that you ran for the People's Party of Canada, and it seems that people who are running for the PPC and people who support the PPC are basically the only ones out there doing anything of any value to our freedom. And first of all, thank you for running for the People's Party. It's a party that this channel has endorsed back in the election of 2019. And I wonder if you couldn't then frame for us UNDRIP, or as it's sort of nicknamed in Canada, CANDRIP, and why it's so important.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, appreciate your work. I watched your work back in 2000 during the election, and that was very good. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the people who ran for the PPC, they're really the awake Canadians who see the dangers. And myself, for me to run was like, that was like jumping over the moon for me. I mean, it was nothing that I would ever want to do, but I felt compelled to do it because I saw that Canada at that election, that was a tipping point for Canada. And the reason why it's a tipping point, well, just the things that you were seeing, but it all has to do with UN Agenda 2030 that no one really seems to know about. And it was Stephen Harper and the Conservatives who signed on to it September 27, 2015. Trudeau was just simply implementing it. So people wanted to go out for the Conservatives at that time to get rid of Trudeau, but they don't realize that they're two sides of the same coin. They're both basically, controlled parties in the sense, like there's hidden hands, it seems like, behind the scenes that guides them towards the UN agendas.
Yes, as a matter of
Okay.
fact, Ron, if I could just briefly interrupt you, I noticed that in
Yeah, sure.
2016, when the Liberal government endorsed UNDRIP to the fullest extent that it could, the Conservatives also agreed in principle to to the objectives of that document. So yes, two
Well,
sides of the same coin. The only place people can go to for any sort of opposition is the People's Party.
that's right. I did see some of the Conservative MPs vote against the bill. It was 262 back then that was introduced in 2018 by Romeo Saganash. He was a two-time NDP Aboriginal lawyer, and he's really the driving force in Canada behind this stuff. And yeah, so I'll show you a good video, exclusive video of what he has to say. We'll pull that in later. But yeah, so really, yeah, it is a PPC that is really the ones that are opposing this. And Maxime Bernier, actually, he was with the Conservative Party when they voted in UN Agenda 2030. And in one of his shows, my question was proposed to him, why is it that they voted for it? And he explained it. And he says, really, the way these things go is that you have Stephen Harper, and it was a foreign minister at the time. They're going over that file, like everyone has their work to do with files. And so they look at it and then they bring it towards the caucus or the group. And they say, well, this is really great stuff. If you read UN Agenda 2030, it's lollipops and rainbows, it sounds like. But if you go deep into it, it's a communist manifesto, actually. And so it gets sold to the people and they don't know too much about it. And they go, okay, we trust them, we'll vote for it, right? That's how it works. Now that Maxine has been educated as to really what's going on, you'll see that he wants to get out of any UN agreement that doesn't have Canada's best interests.
Yes.
Okay, so when I ran in 2019, I ran in northern BC, so Prince George, Peace River, Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies. And there I found out right away about caribou recovery and UNDRIP. And no one was talking about UNDRIP, but up in northern BC, the Aboriginal issues has been going on for a long time. Like they're leading the nation, right? And what's going on. And so a fellow gave me a copy of UNDRIP, and it's really not that big of a book. So what like you said, if people go and look up Bill C-15, Bill C-15 is only a couple pages. And if you go and look at that, below it is the 46 articles of UNDRIP. Now, when I read that document for the first time, the thing that stuck out to me was Article 26. There's 46 articles. And Article 26 says that the Indigenous have the rights to all of the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used.
Yeah.
It is so open-ended, that it's just amazing. So what happened actually after the federal election, 3 days later, John Horgan and the NDP government over there in BC, and most BC residents don't know this, they adopted UNDRIP. And now 95%, I'm told, of BC has been claimed by the Indian bands there. So BC is kind of like the real canary in the coal mine, but Canada is the canary in the coal mine for the whole world, because we're leading out on, because what the bill is, they want to have Canadian law in adherence to the 46 articles of UNDRIP. Okay, so yeah, what happened was in the throne speech, and I recommend people go to my YouTube channel and go and watch that. You can start at 2 minutes for a nice surprise, and then go to 3 minutes and 15 seconds and watch it. In there was one line, and it says basically that they will introduce a new bill for UNDRIP. And then I made an emergency broadcast video at that time, at the end of 2020. It got good traction because I made several videos before that about UNDRIP, but it didn't get a lot of traction. This one got over 40,000 views. And so people started reaching out to me on that. And I started working with some folks, and we've been trying to get people to know about it. And so what happened now was that was introduced, and they wanted to have it, the final vote in the House of Commons roughly around June, July. We started poking our noses around there, and we talked to a Liberal MP. And 3 days later after that, we were told, and it's almost unprecedented, but it has been done before, but they fast-tracked everything now, and they want to have the standing committee finish up their report or whatever by April 22nd. So what has happened now is there's been 2 readings in the House, and when they do a reading, they vote on it, and they both passed. And then after that, it goes to a standing committee, and then they come back with their amendments or reports or whatever, and then they go ahead and vote on it. This is actually what they've been doing, is a pre-standing committee, like they're fast tracking everything, right? And so myself, I've introduced a letter that I sent to my MP, and it's also being sent to other MPs as well by other people. That got in, I sent it over to the committee just on Friday. I know of another group that did the same, and also even the Justice Center in Alberta here with John Carpe, they went ahead and they sent one in too. But really, listening to the first committee meeting, it's pretty much, except for maybe a couple, most of them are all in favor of UNDRIP, So now for context, in 2018, Romeo Saginaw, he introduced a bill called 262, and it had passed the House of Commons, and it was the senators who had blocked it. Many senators voted against it, and some were filibustering or whatever, like dragging their feet on it. And they actually saved Canada in 2019. No one knows about it. And then the election was called, and because the bill wasn't completed, then or had royal assent, then it got killed. That's why we have Bill C-50. So we're in the same place again as 2019. How?
Right. I did not know that, and that is good to know. I know about the Private Members Bill 262, but how it ended up being defeated
Yeah.
by the Senate was something I didn't know.
Yeah, well, no one knows about this stuff, and it's. I know a person whose family member is high up in BC, and they deal with UNDRIP, and they weren't even allowed to talk to their family members. All of this has been done behind the scenes. Now, this is interesting for people who want to vote for the Conservatives. I ran against Bob Zimmer. He's very well liked in his riding and did very well. But we had 8 debates, and I would bring up UN Agenda 2030 and UNDRIP. And he didn't want to talk about those. He only brought it up on the second last meeting where he said, yeah, UNDRIP has been in the play for a long time, and it's, basically, been passed through the House of Commons. He didn't warn anyone about any of the articles. It's left up to us with the PPC or just individual citizens to raise our warning. And if you read my letter, that's very important. You can actually go and read my letter at Mark Friesen's website. It's Forum for Canadian Sovereignty, or you just go ffcs.info. And then at the very top, it'll have a tag called UNDRIP. You read it, it has a couple of my videos. And down at the bottom is a letter that you can go ahead. And it's very important for people in Eastern Canada to contact their MPs and educate them, because most of the MPs don't even know what UNDRIP is, and they'll be voting on it.
Yeah,
and,
one of the
then,
things, sorry, Ron, I just wanted to express to people the importance of all of this, because we've been talking about the details. You've already brought up Article 26, and Article 26 plus the other articles in that document, when and if implemented in this country, could have such a drastic effect on people's private property. For example, right now you see people in government, speakers at universities, speakers in concert halls, preambling their speech with things like, I want to recognize the fact that we are on an indigenous land.
Yes.
And when they say that, once this is implemented, that could be used in a court of law, perhaps, I'm just guessing here, as evidence that, look, people all around, universities, governments, institutions, are recognizing our right over everything.
Absolutely. Like when Bonnie Henry in BC, in one of her meetings, she's the head medical officer there, bringing down all the draconian measures. Before her meeting, they say that we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory, and they list the different bands. Even at this meeting, the first pre-standing committee meeting, they start off, and we can actually even play the video here, where they say that we are on unceded territory as well, right? Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's going on. And I talked to a wealthy business owner in northern BC, and he said that's been going on in northern BC for 4 years. That's the first I ever heard of it.
Yeah, and then when people cede their property to the indigenous groups, and of course, again, to reiterate, all of the indigenous groups are infighting as to who actually has control and can sign these documents, these treaties. But when they do that, people don't realize that from now on, there can be no development, no anything done with property, with the land that they claim to own, without first consulting them. Meaning, of course, you probably have to pay them royalties.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And well, he was saying that we hate it. Like it's all being thrust upon them. It's all the way down to any school meetings or anything. And I says, well, why don't you guys just organize? It's not a big city here or town, and why don't you just agree that when they go ahead and start their meeting like that, everyone just gets up and walks out. And he says, if we did that, it would be noted who walked out, and we would lose our contracts. That's how much power these Indian bands have up there. And really, the bands are small, like they're 200 people. There's only maybe 10 people running a band. They got tremendous power like you wouldn't believe, right? And it's just going to get worse. Now, the whole thing here that people need to realize is, okay, in Bill C-15, they identify Indigenous people according to the charter, the 1982 charter that Trudeau brought in. It's 35.2. And in there they say Aboriginal, it's using another word, Aboriginal is defined as being Indian, Inuit, and Métis people, which actually excludes many peoples in Canada, for one. That was one of the problems in that pre-committee that was brought up by someone who wanted to have it broadened. Okay, but the whole point is that Canadian law is going to be based on the 46 articles of UNDRIP. Okay, that's the basis. Now, UNDRIP itself, you go through the document, there is no definition of what Indigenous is. And I went and I started researching, well, the UN must have their official definition, but they don't have one. They don't have a legal official definition of what Indigenous is. And UNDRIP is their declaration of the rights of these Indigenous people. So what they have on their website is, what someone thinks it is, or, it's not like a legal binding thing at all. So here, just imagine, like we're going to base our Canadian law on UNDRIP, and there's no definition of who Indigenous is.
Right.
It's
Now,
just absolutely off the rails.
I looked up the definition, the dictionary definition is all you can go
Right.
by, I guess, for Indigenous peoples online. And when you do that, you'll find out that virtually every single nation on the planet has what they might call Indigenous people. Now, I wonder if Communist China is going to adhere to the UNDRIP principles when it comes to the Tibetan peoples or to the Uyghurs.
Right. Yeah.
Which are indigenous to that area. Or
Right, yeah.
we're not just talking about Australian Aborigines or Canadian Indians or North American Indians or Inuit. We're talking about so many different, like the native people of what used to be called Formosa, Taiwan today,
Yeah.
right? Are these communist countries like China, Russia, going to give back territory or consult with these self-appointed groups when it comes to things? No, in my estimation, and I'd like your opinion on this, Ron, this is, of course, the United Nations once again beating the West over the head with a hammer in an attempt to destroy the West by taking away the West's property and giving it to people, or peoples as they would like to be described, right, the vast majority of which are tribalistic, collectivist in nature, and more aligned with the philosophy of United Nations than, say, you or I might be.
Oh, for sure. That's the whole thing, right? I mean, you look at the United Nations itself, I mean, there's 150 nations there, like China and other dictatorships and everything else. They do not like our Western lifestyle and our freedoms and the way we run things, right? And so here we're going to have our Canadian laws based on a group that, doesn't have our best interests at heart. And you nailed it. Basically, what this is, it's an attack upon our Western society, right? Because we are the ones that can stop UN Agenda 2030 with our freedoms that we have. UN Agenda 2030, the United Nations wants to have direct control over every single aspect of our lives. I mean, the World Economic Forum is in line, working with them too, and they're saying you'll own nothing and be happy, and that's really where we're headed. And so this UNDRIP issue is about taking the land that you have underneath your property, underneath your cities and everything else to another entity, right? Even as it is now, I mean, we're basically, the Crown owns everything. We're just, but it's all going to be handed over to another group. And so then it's all wild cards, right? At least now we have somewhat of a stable situation, but with no identification of who Indigenous is, it's a real problem, right? In my letter here, I'll just read it to you. UNDRIP does not define Indigenous as being referenced to one's place of birth, right? Indigenous does not reference to one's place of birth. So if one claims to be Indigenous in one country, can they claim UNDRIP rights in another country? And if you go into Article 36, I'll read it to you. Subsection 1, it says Indigenous peoples, in particular those divided by international borders, the UN doesn't want to have borders, right, or nation states. They have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations. Oh, that sounds nice, everyone agree with that. Cooperation, oh, that's fuzzy. Including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes for their own members, as well as other peoples across borders. So depending on how a lawyer would define this, it seems to me that you could have indigenous people coming from, Africa or from, I don't know, Papua New Guinea or wherever into Canada, and they might be able to claim indigenous status over here. I think that's where it's going, because
Quite possible. Yeah.
there's a reason why they want to flood Canada, right? With Liberals, they helped create and also signed on to the Global Compact on migration. Not immigration, migration. So anyone can come into Canada now, and we have to take care of them, basically. And that's, you've seen it in news, right? Rebel Media's covered it. We're paying for their hotels and everything else like that. All this has to do with redistribution of wealth and UN Agenda 2030, because Article 10 in Agenda 2030, they want to have the rich nations poor, the poor nations richer, rich people poor, and the poor people richer, all on the level playing field. Communism right in your face, right? Yeah. And,
it is blatant, and I think that there's one other thing that we have to acknowledge here is that even though we're developing our own cantrip, C15, in it, they are very expressly saying that they wish to implement all, in its entirety, the Articles of UNDRIP as presented as accepted by the United Nations. So anything in here, totally acceptable to the Canadian government.
Oh, absolutely. If this gets adopted, okay, like the House, like when you look at it, unless we can, influence the MPs, it's going to go through the House of Commons. It'll be up to the senators to block it again. Now, what I'm hoping for is that we can actually educate the MPs who are, from the Liberals, the NDP maybe, or whatever, the other parties, and the Conservatives, of course, to educate them to know that they have to vote against this thing, because this is going to absolutely decimate their lives as well, and their families and their friends and everything. Once this gets adopted, who's going to want to invest in Canada? What corporation? Maybe the ones that are in line with the UN takeover of everything, but other corporations are going to flee. We're going to be absolutely decimated financially.
Oh, for sure.
I'll read some other. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead with your letter there, Ron.
Yeah, there's some other articles here that people need to look at. Article 28 is one. Will Canadian taxpayer have to pay, this is what in part of my letter, pay trillions of dollars for equitable compensation when Indigenous claim the land, territories, and resources? Now, what people have to realize is that this is a multi-pronged attack upon our nation, because what they have going on is they have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on in Canada. They also, remember that report that Trudeau commissioned and got released, I think 2019, where it's about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. You've probably heard that?
Yes.
Okay. And those, in order to fulfill those, UNDRIP needs to be enacted in order to bring justice, right? It's important to learn these buzzwords that they're using. It's both the UN and the papacy. They're both using these words, justice, our common home. Common is a word. So there's common home, common core education. The common pass will be the health pass that they're going to, bring upon the whole world, right? There's solidarity is a word that they use.
But it's a lot of flowery language, and if you read through it, some of the things actually try to suck you in to be emotional, have an emotional response to the plight of Indigenous peoples based on a sketchy history.
And one thing I should mention here is that, and this is in the beginning of my letter, is that I believe that all people should be free and equal, right? The UNDRIP is talking about the rights of the Indigenous people exclusive of others, right?
And it's not just Indigenous people, Ron, it's Indigenous peoples. I went through the article, and I think maybe twice or three times they actually mention individuals. The rest of it is peoples, and we're talking about governments.
Yep, oh, absolutely. But okay, people who are identified as Indigenous, they're going to have these rights that are in the UNDRIP articles, where the regular people don't have it. So they're not going to have equal rights. They're selling it as equal rights. They're going to be far superior. They're going to have everything, really. We'll go through some of these things and you'll see. I mean, it's just absolutely mind-boggling, right? And so what it is, you know how politicians are, right? They'll do the double speak. They'll make you think you have one thing when actually you got something else. When you go and look at UN Agenda 2030 and even this UNDRIP thing, it's the ultimate double speak, I guess you'd call it, like you think it's one thing, but then it ends up being something else, like a big Frankenstein, because they have their terminology. And also the whole thing of what's going to happen is there's a Black's Law dictionary, and I don't have the actual definition of indigenous here, but basically it's of the land. But anyhow, there's Article 28, and it has to do with equitable compensation. And I'll read it to you. And just think of the wording here. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution when this is not possible, just and fair equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Can you imagine? Well, we don't want Vancouver on that territory that you built Vancouver on now, and we want to have compensation for it. You're going to have to bulldoze that city down. You know what I mean? Like, how far is this going to go? And Article 30, look at this one. Now, we know that the UN, they don't want nation states having arms, and they want individual citizens not being able to have arms, right? They have their treaty there. So Article 30 says that military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the Indigenous peoples concerned. So here you go. Now BC's 95% claim, from what I understand. Well, you can't have military there unless they agree to it. You know what I mean?
It's pretty much a huge land grab.
Oh, it is. Yeah, absolutely. And because the whole issue is to be able to get us off the land. And now there's a thing by Agenda 2030 all over the world, they want to have 30% of the nation's, land basically kind of in parks and off human occupation. And that has to do with caribou recovery, actually. That was really the first thing I heard about. No one knows about caribou recovery hardly, unless you're in the, these trades that are working up north. But what it was in BC is that for maybe 1,000 or 2,000 caribou, they want to make off limits 1 million to 3 million acres of land. And there's I did a live Facebook interview back with Prince George Matters, and I talked about this, and they didn't want me to really talk about it. The person behind the camera was tapping her foot to get me off the topic of that and UNDRIP. So these people know about it, but they don't want the general public to know. But what happened was in April of 2019, in the small towns, northern towns of BC, they were being told about this caribou recovery thing. The whole point of caribou recovery, they say, is that it's the habitat has to be protected in order for the caribou to come back to the basically ancestral harvesting numbers of the Indigenous peoples. That's the thing, and they don't even want, they don't even like to eat the caribou. People say, I mean, the caribou is not a great, thing to eat, but that's the whole game plan. It's a ruse, to be able to do this massive land grab. And even back then, there were signs going up in the backcountry saying no access. Ultimately, what happened was 3 million acres was set aside for this, and it's to be off limits, for any kind of resource development and everything else. So this is going to decimate or hurt, these small towns, because what they want to do is they want to close up the small towns. They want to make it so that the people who are able to survive off the land and be very individualistic, that they will actually be herded into large cities, and that's what's going on. Like in BC, some of the people in these small towns, in northern BC, they have to go all the way to Vancouver for certain medical procedures because of the finances are being starved in these small towns for medical care, right? So the older people end up having to leave, and so the small towns are having a hard time up there, right? That's all just, part of the game. Well, anyhow, in Alberta, it was happening too. And then I brought up this thing about caribou recovery to the PPC. I says, this is a red alert thing, and they had me talk to another PPC candidate in Quebec who said, yeah, same thing in Quebec. And there's 9,000 jobs going to be lost up in northern Quebec on account of it.
It's amazing.
And they were shutting down the mills too, right? And
Yeah.
now you see lumber prices have just skyrocketed. all of that's a part to make it so that it's going to be incredibly unaffordable to go ahead and build your own building now. And really, you know, I'm learning a way to deal with all of this stuff. And a lot of people go and do protests and everything else like that, and they just kind of just blow it off. What you have to do, and if you go and look at even UNDRIP itself with C15, the Aboriginal people, you know, they're right on this. Like, they're sending in letters and they're being witnesses and they're talking about all this stuff on these committee meetings. That's what we need to do, is we need to get people, we need to set up a watchdog committee, basically. Whenever there's a new bill proposed, or on a federal, provincial, even municipal level, and whenever these things are coming up, that we can flag them and see what they are, and then we can start mounting a defense against them, you know.
For sure.
We need to deal with it on a political level, on that turf, not just, you know, protesting in the streets, because they're just blowing it off, right?
That's the only thing that gets the politicians' attention, is fear of no longer being a politician. So I'm glad that you're running for the PPC in opposition to all of these people. But now let's educate our listeners out there with some links. Like, what is your YouTube channel that they can go to find a bit more about your interest?
Okay, it's under my name, Ron Vaillant, Vaillant. Now, I don't know how long my YouTube channel is going to last. And if I get kicked off there, I don't know if I'm going to start it again. I just might walk away. But I did have all the videos transported over to odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com, and it's under my name again. And so if people can go ahead and educate themselves a little bit, even spend 5 minutes, just go to ffcs.info and go and look at the letter, read the points there. You'll be able to have my perspective of how I understand it. And, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but man, it's pretty simple to see the implications if you just go ahead and look at it.
For sure. And also, I would direct our viewers to go to the United Nations and check on UNDRIP, and the document is all there in a PDF format. It's not very long.
Yeah.
It's 46 articles, but still you can read it.
Yeah, you can do it just by getting Bill C-15. You'll probably see the first reading, usually is what comes up. So in interpretation, they talk about Indigenous peoples, and they refer you to 35.2 of the Constitution Act 1982, which basically defines it as Indian, Inuit, and Métis people. Okay, then after that is purpose of the act. Now, this is basically the whole issue right here. And the purpose of the act is to affirm the Declaration as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canada law. So you notice how it just calls it a human's right instrument, not an Indigenous one. So that's, you know, the conservatives were wondering about what that even means. And B is to provide a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the Declaration, which would be UNDRIP, right? After that is measures for consistency. And number 5, right there, the very first one, it says that Canada will take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. I started screaming from the mountaintops in 2019. And to be quite honest with you, I thought I might get killed back then, because no one was talking about it. And I was bringing up this issue, and it's such a huge issue that, you know, they want to go, you're talking about the whole transformation of our country. And this is going to go worldwide, right? So I was expecting to get, you know, knocked off by a semi on the Highway of Tears as I was driving from Prince George to Dawson. You know? But anyhow, so I did it, most people just, and I was talking to even like Laura Lynn, Tyler Thompson, right? I said, Laura, this is the biggest story, you know, and she has so much on her plate, it just flew over her head at the time, right? And so now, you know, with some interviews, she sees, you know, oh man, you know, this is a real issue.
And it's
that's how it is, because most people, it is so far out there, so far off the side that they say, no, that's crazy stuff, right?
Yeah, and we're coming up to the wire as well with April 22nd, right? So what would you encourage people to do up to that point?
Yeah, okay, so what people can do is, number 1, go to ffcs.info, look at the information, get educated a little bit. If you want to take the letter, go ahead and send it to your MP and say that you're not in favor of it, and tell them to get educated as to what's really issues are. Talk to your friends, you know, like, you know, get serious about it. the other thing is to start, if someone can go ahead and contact these news organizations in the States to say, look, Canada is a canary in the coal mine, and this is huge, and this is worldwide, and it's most likely going on in the United States. Like, there was one state, I don't know what it was, Indiana or some, that half of the state is basically claimed by the Indians, and the judges there, I don't know if it was the judges of the state but they're saying, yeah, basically the Native Indians really have claim for half of the state. Yeah, so we're raising the alarm, and people need to start raising the alarm all over the place, because if this goes through and it goes through the Senate, then we're done. I mean, it's a total UN takeover, right? And it's what I tell people now is, the UN Agenda 2030, they want to have that in place, and radical change is going to happen in the next 5 years, like you wouldn't even believe, in order to achieve it. And after 2019, when the election ended there, I was really depressed for 3 months. Like, I've never been depressed like that before, like sad, like deep in my soul. And people were saying, what's wrong with Ron? He's downcast, but I just knew that the most insane, craziest things are going to happen in Canada now, because our shields are down and we have no defense. Like, there's no voice, there's no nothing. It's all of the parties, the Conservatives, Liberals, NDP, Greens on the block, they're all UN globalist parties. And they're all, and not only that, but then you have all these premiers, they're all UN globalists down to the city level. Like, you have Edmonton and Calgary, Montreal and Ottawa now, they are all UN strong cities. Can you believe it? What does that mean, right? And then you have, Menchie there over in Calgary wanting to defund the police right away. And that's what they want to do. They want to take away our natural defense, like with the police forces that we have, and also with our military, and bring in the UN troops, right?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, Ron, from all fronts, and this is just, like I said at the beginning, just another hammer in the arsenal of the United Nations and the globalists to destroy us.
Yeah, like the whole thing of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I was driving home after work, and I thought, well, I'll turn on CBC to see what's on, the 6 o'clock news, right? And I stopped listening a long time ago. I hate it, but I turned it on anyhow. And then they talked about this paper, and basically the conclusion of the paper is that it's an imperialistic genocide. Sure. And then I've been in this game since the mid 80s, looking at, the world takeover and everything else like that. And you tell people, and it's too hard to relate to. They just say, oh, Ron, and I have a reputation. Oh, Ron, that's Ron. He's out there and, in his twilight zone, right? And now people are really beginning to see, well, hey, something really is going on here, because this makes no sense whatsoever, right? And so educating people and trying to get some media here. We need media on this story. So if we can get especially big media in the States, we can put pressure on, the MPs in Canada to at least know about it, right? And then to start looking at the dangers that is involved. And at the bottom of the letter, I say, look, if there's a party whip, they call it, right? If Trudeau says, look, this is something that we want to endorse, everyone has to vote in favor of it. If you don't, well, face the consequences. And look at Derek Sloan, right? Yeah, Derek Sloan got axed out of the Conservative Party, which tells you a lot right there. And so that's how it goes. And so these MPs need to know that this is for all the marbles. And they have to be willing to, as a soldier, be willing to go and take the hit now, right? It's up to them now. If they will vote against it, then they lose their party status or whatever. It may look like the end of their political career, but really it might be their finest hour to go ahead and to really stand up for what is right. And if they get axed out of the party, they can always, maybe run as an independent or run for the PPC or something else, right? Who knows? Or maybe go on to something else that might be a higher calling even yet. But they will be looked upon as Canadian heroes if they can. This is our best line of defense, is to kill it with the MPs, because once it goes into the Senate, it's one more stop, and there's a lot of pressure that gets put on those guys too to go ahead and adopt this. So, yeah. I'm hoping for the impossible, that we can get the MPs educated and that they will be doing the right thing and be willing to be brave and stand up for what is right,
Well,
to save their nation.
thank you for bringing this to our attention.
Okay, well, thank you for your work.
Thank you.